Questions without notice. Are there any questions? And I give the call to the honourable member for Hume.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister rule out breaking his election promise to deliver the Stage 3 tax cuts in full?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
We haven't changed our position on the Stage 3 tax cuts at all. At all.
Give the call to the honourable member for order. Give the call to the honourable member for Newcastle.
Thank you. My question's to the Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations. How is the Albanese Labor government closing the loopholes that undercut workers' pay, and what opposition has the government had to overcome to close the loopholes?
Call to the Minister for Employment, Industrial Relations and Minister for the Arts.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Newcastle both for the question and for her commitment to working people. Because the member for Newcastle has done something today that those opposite couldn't bring themselves to. And that's the member for Newcastle decided to vote for the Closing Loopholes Bill. And this now means we now have 27 times when those opposite have voted to keep wages low. They had 9 years where low wage growth was a deliberate design feature of their management of the economy, and then as the legislation has come through both on secure jobs, better pay and on closing the loopholes, at every possible opportunity where they had an opportunity to delay getting wages moving, to oppose an amendment that would improve wages, at every opportunity they voted no to getting wages moving and effectively continuing their position that they need to keep wages low. So determined to vote no that when the member for Wentworth moved an amendment simply saying this bill should be reviewed in 2 years' time, they voted no to that as well. Every opportunity they have where they can look at anything that in any way could keep wages low, that's the side that they'll be on. Well, I'm pleased that the Closing Loopholes Bill has now passed the House of Representatives. I'm pleased that that means the legislation has now passed this place that gives a fair deal for casual workers, that gives minimum standards for gig workers, who have no minimum standards at all. There were no amendments from those opposite, no attempt to say, oh, maybe you should do the minimum standards differently. Their position remained, if you're a gig worker, your minimum standard should be zero. No minimum rates at
Member
all.
for O'Connor will cease interjecting.
And once again, just as they did last term, when the opportunity was there to say, should it be a crime for an employer to steal your wages, they voted no. Voted no to making wage theft a crime. Not the first time they did this. They did it to their own legislation last term as well. That somehow they think it's reasonable that if someone steals from the till, it's a crime, as it should be, but if the employer steals from the workers' wages, nothing to see here, no crime there at all. And finally, it'll close the labour hire loophole. And I've got to say, for all the talk that they may have dusting themselves with coal at different points, there's not a single coal miner in the country who doesn't know that if a labour hire worker is doing the exact same job as them, with the same experience, same level of skills, they should be earning the same amount of money.
Order. There is far too much noise in the chamber. I've already had to mention the member for O'Connor and the member for Barker 3 or 4 times. They are now both warned. We're not having a repeat from yesterday. There's far too much noise. I want to hear from the member for Nichols.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Labor's Murray-Darling Basin plan has been estimated by water market specialist Waterfind to cost up to $22 billion to deliver in full. Has the government undertaken modelling on the cost to taxpayers and the financial and social impacts on basin communities of water buybacks, which will drive up prices at the supermarket for all Australian families?
Order. Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thanks so much, Mr Speaker. Well, the first thing to say, of course, is that It's very clear that last time voluntary water purchase happened, the largest year of voluntary water purchase, 2011-2012, when almost 500 gigalitres of water was bought, food and beverage prices actually went down by 3.2%. So let's not pretend that this is an automatic thing.
Members on my left.
The second thing I think it is really important to say.
Order. The minister will pause. The Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. Just said there's far too much noise in the chamber. The minister will be heard in silence, just as the question was heard in silence.
Yeah, and the next thing I would like to say is those opposite, the National Party, are perfectly happy for anyone to buy water other than the Australian government to protect the environment. They're very happy for foreign companies to buy water. In fact, more water is owned by foreign companies that is owned by the Commonwealth Environment Water Holder. They're very happy to sell water. The member for New England, the shadow minister, when he was the water minister, bought $80 million of water.
The minister will pause. The Leader of the Nationals on a point of order.
On relevance, Mr Speaker.
Order. Members on my right.
Don't laugh at what you don't understand.
Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the Nationals will get to his point of order quickly.
Relevance, Mr Speaker. The question was very specific about whether the government has done any modelling on their Murray-Darling Basin plan to communities and the cost of implementing that.
The minister has had a preamble. The question was not about the opposition or their policies. I'm going to ask Director back to the question.
No, but thank you, Mr Speaker. I would say...
Order.
I would say...
The Leader of the Nationals...
It is... If the Leader of the Nationals really cared about farming communities, he would pass this legislation, because he knows that if this legislation is not passed by the end of the Senate sitting period, then there will be automatic reconciliation that will drop water entitlements automatically. You should know that. And when the member for New England was the water minister, he was happy to buy water. He bought $80 million worth of water from a company set up in the Cayman Islands by the Shadow Treasurer. So they don't mind. They don't mind water buybacks if it's a foreign company. If it's a foreign company. If it's the Shadow.
The minister will pause. Order. The member for Hume. Order. The minister needs to be relevant to the question. She's been asked about the government costing their buybacks plan and about cost for families. I need to make sure she's clear that her answer is relevant to the question. If she's not relevant, she'll be sat down. The minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, there has been plenty of modelling done.
Members on my left.
Including by Sarah Wheeler, who is a well-respected economist, who has shown that the modelling that the member claims shows that water buybacks push up prices is discredited, and the modelling that the Victorian government is relying on is completely discredited.
The minister will pause.
Sarah Wheeler.
The minister will pause. The member for O'Connor is on a warning. It was made crystal clear that he'd interject, he'd leave the chamber, and that's what he'll do now. The minister will continue.
You don't want to hear it. The modelling done by Sarah Wheeler and other economists has shown that, of course, there are all sorts of things that affect food and beverage prices: floods, droughts, fuel prices, labour shortages, which you did nothing to deal with for farming economies when you were in government. Other thing that affects food prices are trade embargoes, like the ones that this government has successfully dealt with. So instead of pretending to help farmers, why don't you vote for the bill and actually...
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting immediately, so I can hear from the member for Jagga Jagga.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. What does the most recent inflation data tell us, and what steps is the government taking to alleviate cost of living pressures? What approaches has the government rejected?
I call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the terrific member for Jagga for her question about today's inflation figures. Today's inflation figures showed that annual inflation moderated from 5.6% in September to 4.9% last month. Now, this was a substantial moderation, and it was a much better outcome than the market expected. This means that monthly inflation is much lower than the 6.1% we inherited at the time of the election last year. Let me be really clear about that, Mr Speaker. On today's measure, inflation was higher under those opposite than it is in the numbers that we have received today. Now, Mr Speaker, we know and we acknowledge that inflation is still too high and will be with us for longer than we'd like, and these monthly numbers do jump around a bit, which makes the quarterly numbers more reliable. But the substantial moderation that we see in today's numbers is still very welcome and very encouraging news. We're making progress, but we know that people are still doing it tough. And that's why we're rolling out tens of billions of dollars of cost of living help, and why we are pleased to see very clearly in recent data that our cost of living package is taking some of the edge off inflation. Let me give you one example, Mr Speaker. Without our plan, electricity prices would have gone up 18.8% between June and October, not 8.4%. And the ABS made it clear in their recent data that without our plan, inflation would have been 0.5 percentage point higher than it was. Now, Mr Speaker, this is the cost of living help that those opposite voted against. If they had prevailed in this House, inflation would be higher and wages would be lower, and people would be in an even bigger financial hole than they find themselves today, Mr Speaker. And we need to remember that when they come in here and cry their crocodile tears about cost of living. They voted for electricity and rent and other key things to be more expensive, not less expensive. When they voted in this House, Mr Speaker, they are long on nasty negativity. They are short of solutions or credibility. Now, Mr Speaker, we are working for Australia and we are making progress in the fight against inflation. Our cost of living plan is taking some of the edge off these pressures. We're getting the budget in much better nick in ways that's drawn the support of the IMF, Fitch ratings agencies and the RBA Governor when she was asked. We are investing in housing and energy and skills, Mr Speaker, and we are cleaning up the mess that those opposite left behind. And we see in today's new inflation figures some welcome and encouraging progress on that front.
Before I call the member for Mackellar, I just want to do some acknowledgements and welcome to our parliament. I'm pleased to inform the House that present in the gallery today is a delegation from Queensland, led by the Deputy Premier of Queensland, the Honourable Stephen Miles MP, including the Mayor of Toowoomba and the Mayor of Isaac Regional Council. I also want to welcome the Mayor of the City of Palmerston, a guest of the member for Solomon, Ms Anthea Pascoe-Bell, the Ambassador of Uruguay to Australia, Her Excellency Mrs Dianella P, and also in the gallery, in the Special Visitors Gallery today, is representatives of the Movember Foundation, a wonderful charity doing amazing things. On behalf of the House, welcome to Question Time. And I give the call, the Prime Minister on indulgence.
Yeah, just maybe a shout out as well for the crew from Movember. Who are here, Michelle Terry, the CEO, and Richard Deutsch, the Chair of Movember. 20th anniversary of Movember. I'm advised by my staff who participate in Movember, sometimes more than I would like, that they have raised over $1 billion over 20 years. That is quite an extraordinary effort. So congratulations to all who are involved and all who participate.
And on indulgence, the Leader of the Opposition.
Let's say the Prime Minister's giving me a bit of stick about facial hair. Or I would say, as the father of 2 sons, one of whom's just come back from school. He's sporting a mullet and a big mo. That other Australians should follow suit, even against their parents' advice, but do it in the name of Movember. And if you are after a good cause to support, or you're thinking of somebody who is far away but that you would like to give an early Christmas present to, I'd advise all Australians to go to the Movember website to provide sponsorship and support to a very worthy cause. I commend all of those who are involved in the promotion, in the governance and in a program that every Australian has really taken as a very special cause. So congratulations to all those involved. And I'd love to be joining you this year, but perhaps a donation in lieu would be sufficient. Thank you.
And I give the call. And I give the call to the honourable member for Mackellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. During the last election campaign, the government promised to expand the water trigger in the EPBC Act to include shale gas projects. And following the Pepper inquiry, the Northern Territory government also promised to not approve any shale gas fracking projects until this was completed and implemented. So with several shale gas fracking projects in the Beetaloo Basin due to be approved in the near future, will the government ensure that an expanded water trigger is in place before any of these projects are given the green light? Thank you.
Give the call to the Minister for the Environment and Water.
Thanks so much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Mackellar for her question and for her continued interest and advocacy for the environment. She's raised the issue of the water trigger with me a number of times, as has, I have to say, the member for Lingiari, who is raising it with me very often, and other members of parliament as well. Indeed, before the election, we did commit to expanding environmental assessments to cover all forms of non-conventional gas, including shale gas. And it's also part of our Nature Positive plan that we released last year, and absolutely we will do that. In the meantime, I've said that the federal government has made available to the Northern Territory government our independent expert scientific committee on coal seam gas and large coal mining development to assist the Northern Territory government or any other jurisdiction with these decisions. That's the same committee that would assess these projects once the water trigger is expanded. I want to reassure that the member for Mackellar and others who have an interest in this that we absolutely will keep this commitment, because in the years since the original water trigger was added to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, at that time coal seam gas was relatively novel. Since then, we've seen other forms of gas come onto the market, and of course it's just common sense that we need to cover those types of gas as well. We do need to protect our most precious resource, water, for all its important purposes. Yes, there are industrial purposes obviously, but drinking water first amongst the important needs we have as a community. And of course, not just that, the environmental impacts of some of these projects are really very important. We don't want to see chemical contamination of our waterways, of the environment around these projects. We absolutely need to make sure that there isn't that sort of impact from the projects. We also know that the water from these being used in these large projects can have potentially very significant impacts on fragile ecosystems through dewatering, and that's another thing that obviously the updates to the water trigger will deal with. We will continue to work with the member for Mackellar, with others on the crossbench who've raised this with me, with the member for Lingiari, who doesn't stop on this one, and others with an interest in this, to make sure we keep the commitment.
Call to the honourable member for Corangamite.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How is the Albanese Labor government tackling cost of living pressure in the face of obstruction, and what measures are taking effect in the coming year?
The call to the Prime Minister.
I thank the member for Corangamite for her question. And today, of course, there have been two issues that go straight to cost of living. One is the latest inflation figures showing a moderation from 5.6 down to 4.9. That's a good thing.
Order.
It's heading in the right direction. The measures that we've put in place are having an impact. It's not moving as quickly as we would like, but it does make a difference. And secondly, of course, is the passing of the industrial relations legislation by this House, which is aimed at lifting up wages, just like the measures that we put in place
to
give a 15% increase for aged care workers, just like the increase in the minimum wage has made a difference. The manager of opposition business interjects about wage price spiral. Well, there's no indication from the Reserve Bank that that is happening. Indeed, the idea that he reinforces their opposition to any wage increase. The same people who said that a $1 an hour increase in the minimum wage would wreck the economy are people who continue to argue that, and that's why they voted against the legislation there today. We are making a difference of getting costs down for families with cheaper medicines, cheaper childcare, energy bill relief. We're getting wages up for workers, and we're getting the budget onto a stronger foundation. And more help is on the way from measures that we've passed that will take effect next year. From the 1st of January, we're increasing the amount that people on the age pension can work. All new age pensioners will commence with a $4,000 work bonus credit, allowing them to work more without affecting their pension. All 58 of our urgent care clinics will be open by the end of the year, meaning families can get the care they need. They don't need their credit card, just a Medicare card. The National Skills Agreement will take effect, making an enormous difference, meaning that from next year an additional 300,000 fee-free TAFE places will be coming online, making a difference for families and for people undertaking those apprenticeships, but also helping with skills shortages right across the economy. Of course, those opposite continue to interject, continue to vote against everything, continue to be totally against every measure that is done.
Will cease interjecting.
They're here to get angry. I'm here to get things done. And that's precisely what my government is doing.
Members on my left, and the House comes to order. We'll hear from the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. The minister failed to prepare for an expected High Court loss and then falsely claimed she was advised she would win. She claimed urgent laws weren't necessary until we wrote them for her. She claimed the Coalition's preventative detention proposal was utterly impossible, but now says Parliament won't rise without legislating it. She can't explain how one of the criminals she released has disappeared. Minister, why is your job safe when the Australian public is not?
Order. Members on my right will cease interjecting before the Minister speaks. The Minister for Home Affairs and Cybersecurity has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. I'll leave the political commentary to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition there. And I would say to those of you who are here in the chamber that I see that the Opposition's had a little bit of a meeting this morning and they've decided that they're going to spend today making a political attack on me. Well, congratulations. Congratulations. You can do that, and you're free to do that. But I would just say that it says a hell of a lot more about you than it does about me.
Order. The Minister will pause. The Minister will pause. There is far too much noise. The Deputy Leader was heard. The Minister is going to be heard in silence. I'm now issuing a general warning. So that the Minister will cease interjecting while I'm speaking. So will the Leader of the Opposition. So that means now no more warnings. If people interject, they leave. The Minister has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. So let me compare and contrast a little bit about how the government has handled this High Court decision and what we've seen from those opposite. What we've seen from the government is that within a week and 1 day of the High Court decision, We had released the people that the High Court ordered us to release under bespoke visas. We had set up a completely new regime of community protection. We had established a joint operation between police and ABF who are case managing each of these individuals in the community. Now, Speaker, we have the reasons for decision from the High Court, and as I have said, I would have preferred that none of these people be released from detention. I support preventative detention, and that is why I will be bringing a proposal back to the Parliament. Now, we will be able to move through this quite quickly, Speaker, if we get the support and the cooperation of the opposition. But what have we seen since this decision was made? We have seen 3 weeks of the most shameless politics I have virtually ever seen played in this parliament. And that included, Speaker, included the opposition's unbelievable action earlier this week, where we brought a proposal to this parliament, the Minister for Immigration brought a proposal to this parliament to strengthen the laws that we passed to criminalise paedophiles loitering near schools. A pretty uncontroversial proposal. But what did they do? They came in and they voted against it. And there was only one reason for that, because they put politics above the safety of the Australian community. But that's not all, Speaker. That's not all, Speaker. We heard some very disturbing news earlier this week where the Minister for Immigration revealed to us that a hand-picked member of the opposition leader's front bench has used his position as a senator to advocate—
The Minister will pause. Member for Casey has been interjecting throughout question time. He'll now leave under 94A. Whoever's laughing down the back there, a member for Macarthur, not sure if it's you, but it's far too much noise. Order. The Leader of the Opposition will cease interjecting. The Minister in continuation.
Thank you, Speaker. We heard some very disturbing news earlier this week that a hand-picked person on the front bench of the Leader for the Opposition has used his position as a senator, not once but twice, to advocate for the release from detention of a child sex offender. Speaker, a child sex offender.
Order. The Deputy Leader of the Opposition is seeking a point of order. The Minister will pause. Minister will pause.
Mr Speaker, the point of order is on relevance. How can those remarks possibly be relevant? And you, Mr Speaker, have ruled that constantly reflecting on the opposition is not an answer to a question from us to a minister.
Order. Member for Lawler, the Leader of the House.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Just to the point of order, the relevance rule got really broad, I suspect, when the Deputy Leader of the Opposition got to the tag at the end of that question, and that certainly opened it up.
The question was about specific issues, and the last part of the question was about the Australian public not being safe, and some compare and contrast is allowed under the broad nature of the question. But the Minister is in order, but if she strays, I'll make sure she returns to the question.
Thank you, Speaker, and I hope I'll get the opportunity to return to the matter of Senator Smith and the utter failure of the Leader of the Opposition to show leadership on this matter shortly. But before I finish up, Speaker, let me say this. We have to come together as a parliament now and find a long-term solution to this matter. Now, we are here, and while you are in meetings plotting about your political strategy, we're in meetings doing the work and solving the problems we need.
Give the call to the member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs. How is the Albanese Labor government responding to the High Court reasoning announced yesterday? How is the government acting to keep Australians safe? And what approaches has the government rejected?
Give the call to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs.
Thank you, Speaker. And I thank my good friend, the member for Bendigo, for her question and recognise her keen interest in these issues. And I want to begin, of course, again by thanking the members of the ABF and the Federal Police for their efforts, their outstanding efforts, working with state and territory law enforcement officials to ensure community safety, our number one focus. And say again, earlier this week, we passed legislation through the House to make strong laws even stronger, as the Minister for Home Affairs just made clear. And I say again, we are working to make it an offence for recently released detainees to go within 200 metres of a school, daycare centre or childcare centre. Shockingly, members opposite who are interjecting voted against this, not once, but twice. Now, yesterday the High Court has handed down its reasons, and we have made very clear that we want to put in place a strong and a durable preventative detention regime, which is needed for the most serious offenders, something I would hope that all members would agree. Because we need this parliament to come together to make this a reality. And we expect the opposition to work with us on this, because it's not their tough talk that makes a difference. It is strong laws in place. And I'm asked about alternatives, Speaker. And of course this week we've seen Senator Smith, who wrote a letter requesting that a convicted pedophile be released from immigration detention. He asked that he be transferred from Christmas Island into the community, knowing the serious nature of this man's offending. He still requested this release, as the Minister for Home Affairs just said twice. Let me be clear. I didn't let him out. Community safety is the utmost priority of this side of the chamber. But I can tell you who did make a decision, Speaker. I can tell you who did. The Leader of the Opposition. That's right, the Leader of the Opposition intervened as the then Minister for Immigration to allow the convicted pedophile at the centre of the High Court case, NZYQ, to apply for a new visa, instead of seeking to have him removed from Australia. The Leader of the Opposition instead made a decision that enabled him to stay in this country. The Leader of the Opposition's personal intervention meant that he was allowed to remain in Australia until the day the High Court made its decision. This ultimately is his mess. Once again, this Leader of the Opposition talks tough, but he acts weak. It is time for him and his team to stop playing political games and work with us to keep Australians safe.
Give the call to the Honourable Order. Order. The Leader of the Opposition has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government has been flat-footed and asleep at the wheel since the High Court decision on the 8th of November. That much and much more is obvious. Now, Mr Speaker, given the...
Members on my right will cease interjecting immediately. The Treasurer will cease interjecting. Order. The Leader of the Opposition will begin his question again. It's going to be heard in absolute silence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The government's been caught flat-footed and asleep at the wheel since the High Court decision on the 8th of November. The seriousness of this matter includes the release of one high-risk offender into the community, potentially a rapist, potentially a child sex offender. The government refuses to provide any detail. Can the Prime Minister update the Australian public what risk there is to them, and what detail does he have to give some assurance to the Australian people that this individual will be brought back into custody as soon as humanly possible?
Prime Minister has the call. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question and his dexterity in pointing out who was flat-footed when they ran out of questions after 4 today. The fact is this: in the months leading up to the High Court's decision, the government was preparing for the possibility of the Court's decision overturning coalition government legislation, with community safety as our primary focus. And that is what enabled the government to respond quickly, to engage with police and officials.
The Prime Minister will pause. The member for Bowman has been constantly interjecting. He'll leave under 94A. There is a general warning. It's not a free-for-all. People just can't feel that they can just say what they want when they want. Constantly. Prime Minister in continuation.
That is what enabled senior ABF officials to brief local, state and territory police counterparts on the possible implications of the case to establish Operation Aegis in November. We then, of course, did have to comply with the High Court decision, overturning coalition government legislation. But we applied strict visa conditions and monitoring requirements to the cohort, including daily reporting requirements.
The Prime Minister is answering directly the question with detail, so I'll give, out of courtesy, I'll give the Leader of the Opposition the call, but he's going to state the point of order and not give commentary during his statement.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's on relevance, and you've made a point in relation to relevance. I'm happy to address that issue that you've raised. I asked the question, quite a serious question of the Prime Minister, about an individual who is at large in the Australian community at the moment. The government refuses to provide detail about whether this person is a sex offender, a pedophile, somebody who is involved in serious... And the Prime Minister owes the Australian people...
Prime Minister was talking directly about the High Court decision on Order! 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 Under the standing orders, the Prime Minister must be relevant to the question. Order. The member for Gellibrand. Prime Minister in continuation.
As the Minister for Immigration just pointed out, the High Court required the release of individuals with similar circumstances to NZYQ who took the case. If NZYQ had have been deported, instead of being granted permission to apply for a visa by the person who was the minister at the time, the Leader of the Opposition, none of this would have occurred. None of this would have occurred. None of this would have occurred because he wouldn't have been able to take the legal action. He asks about people. I just quote from 26th of April 2018. Detainees at immigration detention centres on Australian shores have successfully escaped more than 80 times on the former government's watch. More than 80 times between 2013 and 2018. Now, lest you don't think that's 80 people,
Order.
It's more than that. It's more than that because the total number of detainees who escaped detention during the period would be higher because some reported incidents have involved more than one person.
Order.
12th of November 2014, an underworld figure capable of extreme violence is on the run after escaping from a Victorian detention centre he was being held in as he awaited deportation from the country. Minister for Immigration and Border Protection Scott Morrison confirmed the breakout. I can confirm. 2 adult male detainees absconded from the Maribyrnong Immigration Detention Centre early today without side.
Order. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for McEwen.
Thank you. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. What is the Albanese Labor government doing to keep the community safe in the wake of the High Court decision on indefinite detention? What other approaches to community safety have been raised?
Give the call to the Minister for Home Affairs and the Minister for Cybersecurity.
Thank you so much, and I thank the member for their question. Speaker, one thing has guided our government through the last few weeks as we've worked through this issue, and that is the safety of the Australian community. That's why we have moved as quickly as we have to implement the measures that have been executed on so far, and that is why we are moving quickly to implement a preventative detention regime within the parameters laid down by the High Court 24 hours ago. And I'd say the Prime Minister has made this absolutely clear to the parliament. We will not rise as a parliament until we have a preventative detention regime in place. And I call on those opposite to come out and support the work that Labor is doing to put this in place. Speaker, you would think that the government's approach to this matter would be bipartisan because we have been driven by community safety. But we have seen and heard some extraordinary things from the opposition this week. We saw on Monday, the opposition, led by the Leader of the Opposition, come into the parliament and vote to protect pedophiles over children. That's what they did. Voted to protect pedophiles over children. There was nothing objectionable in that bill, and yet Labor's attempt to criminalise pedophiles loitering near schools was voted against by the Leader of the Opposition. And we have also heard, Speaker, that Senator Smith, a hand-picked member of the opposition leader's front bench, chose to use his power, his precious power, as an Australian senator to advocate for a child sex offender. He didn't do it once, he did it twice. This is an individual who was convicted of child sex offences involving a teenage girl. And Senator Smith described in his letter, he described that offending in his second letter to the Immigration Minister as being, quote, on a consensual and non-consensual level. And I'll leave it to the Leader of the Opposition to explain what Senator Smith could possibly have meant by consensual sex with a child. Now, the Leader of the Opposition loves to talk tough. We hear it all day on borders, on immigration, on national security, but the record just doesn't back it up. Surely, Speaker, surely this is the simplest test yet. We hear again and again the Leader of the Opposition come into the chamber and make heartfelt speeches about child sex offences, yet he has an apologist for this conduct on his front bench. He can do something to change it, and I call on him to do it.
Call to the honourable member for Wannon.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Immigration. Al Jazeera has reported that Cyril Azhar Umar, who was sentenced in Malaysia for the murder of a pregnant woman that involved shooting her and then blowing up her body with explosives, was released from immigration detention into the Australian community not wearing a tracking device or subject to a curfew. Can the Minister confirm whether this is true?
Call to the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship and Multicultural Affairs.
Thank you, Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Minister for his question. I will say that if I am unaware of those media reports, I'll obviously look into them. I can say that, as I've said repeatedly, that every person required to be released by order of the High Court was done so, and in respect of every one of them, 141, strict visa conditions were applied initially, and then following, of course, the passage of legislation that we were able to get through the Parliament on the Thursday of the last sitting week. Obviously, in respect of the persons subject to the conditions after the passage of legislation, I was required to make a determination in respect of each of them in respect of the additional condition.
Has the Minister concluded his answer? Move to the member for Hunter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. What are the recent practical steps the Albanese Labor government has taken in the pursuit of defence policy? Why is this required after a wasted decade?
Give a call to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Last Thursday, the Minister for Defence Industry, on behalf of the government, announced a strategic shipbuilding partnership with Austal, which represents the first occasion on which the Commonwealth Government has committed to continuous naval shipbuilding in Western Australia. And we are doing that by accelerating the delivery of Army's landing craft heavy and medium. And so in the process, we will provide for a more agile and more nimble Army which is capable of projection. And this is entirely consistent with the foundational thinking that has been undertaken in the Defence Strategic Review, the central thesis of which is to build for our country a defence force that is capable of impactful projection. And so, be it bringing forward the delivery of our nuclear-powered submarines by a decade, or properly investing in our long-range strike capability, or restructuring our Army so that it is better able to operate beyond our shores, all of these decisions have been taken with the singular focus of giving us a defence force which can project, and that, Mr Speaker, is how defence policy is done. And it stands in stark contrast to those opposite, because those opposite didn't do defence policy, they did defence politics. They didn't do strategy, they did hoopla. They spent the better part of a decade yelling at China, and yet in the same time they opened up a gaping capability gap with our submarines. They talked a massive game when it came to defence spending, and yet at the same time they secretly squirreled billions of dollars out of the defence budget.
Deputy Leader of the
But,
Opposition.
Mr Speaker, we should not be surprised because that is how they operated, but it is how they continue to operate, and across the board. I mean, we have heard the Leader of the Opposition talk a massive game when it comes to community safety, and yet at the very same time,
Gippsland.
a member of his front bench is writing letters advocating for the release of a convicted child sex offender. And right there, Mr Speaker, is a test for his leadership, a test which he will fail, just as he has failed to provide for the defence of our country. Well, Mr Speaker, our government is very different. We have engaged in the strategic thinking and we are backing it up with the practical decisions which are keeping Australians safe.
Call the member for Herbert. I give the call to the member for Curtin.
This is a question for the Treasurer. In the Employment White Paper, the government says productivity growth must be the key driver of improvements in living standards over the long term. We have an extremely complex industrial relations system, made more complex by today's passage of the Closing the Loopholes Bill. How could adding this complexity possibly improve our productivity?
Call to the Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the member for Curtin for her question and also for her interest and her engagement in the Employment White Paper that the government released not that long ago. I do believe that the lift in living standards that we desperately need as a country in the coming years will come from a more productive, more competitive, more dynamic economy. And I believe that the overwhelming majority of employers and employees and communities want to find a way to strike better agreements to get stronger wages growth and stronger productivity growth and less conflict so that we can prosper together. I don't believe that the path to productivity in this country is to make people work longer and harder for less. And here's where I depart, Mr Speaker, from those opposite in their approach to industrial relations. And if you think about the Closing the Loopholes Bill that was before the House and which I'm proud to say passed through this place earlier today, and I pay tribute to the Minister and to the Cabinet and the Government for the effort that went into that, is that we will not get more productivity in our economy by letting wage theft go scot-free. We won't get more productivity in our economy if we make it easy for people to undermine agreements in our economy, agreements that are struck in good faith. We can't see those undermined. Undermining those agreements or letting wage theft go unpunished won't boost productivity in our economy. We won't get productivity growth by treating workers as some kind of easily discarded input into the prosperity that we want to create together as a nation. Now, we know from the last decade, Mr Speaker, of deliberate wage suppression and deliberate wage stagnation that that's not the path to better productivity outcomes. We know that because a decade of wage stagnation and suppression came hand in hand with the worst decade for productivity growth in the 60 years that these records have been kept. So we won't get productivity growth through harsh industrial relations, but I will tell the House and the member how we will get productivity growth in our economy after a wasted decade. We will get productivity growth in our economy by making it more competitive. That's why we've got the process around competition. We will get productivity in our economy if we invest in our human capital, in our skills base, if we make it easier to adapt and adopt technology, if we make it more effective to deliver care in our economy. We'll get a more productive economy if we get the energy transformation right. These are the ways. These are the ways that a forward-looking, modern economy delivers productivity growth, which has been absent for too long because our vision has been unnecessarily narrowed by those opposite to industrial relations.
Has concluded. Give the call to the honourable member for Aston.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
How will the Albanese Labor government's expanded capacity investment scheme support reliable electricity, and what has been the response to this significant announcement?
Give a call to the Minister for Climate Change and Energy.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for her question. And what a difference she's made to the House since her arrival in April, Mr Speaker, her very positive arrival. Now, Mr Speaker, the honourable member asked me about the expanded capacity investment scheme, and it will support much more reliable energy right throughout our country. And in fact, the 32 gigawatts of generation it will support will be enough for 10.5 million households, Mr Speaker. And it's important that we replace energy that is leaving the grid before it leaves. We had almost 27 gigawatts of announced generation leaving the grid under the previous government and no plan to replace it for 9 years. And of course, the honourable member asked me how the announcement has been received. And perhaps most importantly, the state and federal energy ministers met last week and issued a communique. And that communique is, of course, unanimous. And the state and territory energy ministers, which represents Labor ministers, a Greens minister and a Liberal minister, agreed and issued the statement which said energy ministers welcomed the Commonwealth's significant expansion in the capacity investment scheme. And they went on to say the Commonwealth's leadership follows an extended period where state and territory governments have led the energy transition through their significant investments and policy reforms. I'm not quite sure what they were referring to there, Mr Speaker, over the last decade, but it's true to say that states were leading through a very difficult period for energy policy. And of course, the Rockcliffe government in Tasmania also issued their own statement and said the Rockcliffe Liberal government welcomes today's announcement that the federal government is taking positive action to support bringing more renewable energy projects online. And there's the Rockcliffe government backing the Albanese government on this very important initiative, as have every single state and territory government. And of course, energy users, the big winners out of better and more reliable energy, they've had plenty to say. Energy Users Association of Australia said, "We welcome the announcement from the Commonwealth as it should provide a level of certainty for investors and consumers in these highly volatile times." And of course, Mr Speaker, Energy Consumers Australia said, "We welcome this morning's announcement, which is both an important step in providing reliable energy to consumers and a continued firm commitment by the federal government." So there's a very positive response across the board. Of course, there is one exception, the member for Fairfax. He's been disappointed. He said in December he was worried that, and I quote, "Labor kills the capacity mechanism," he said. He said in December Labor had killed the capacity mechanism. Today he's worried it's too alive. It was dead in December, now it's too alive, according to the member for Fairfax. I understand his sensitivity. The last 9 years was one long incapacity mechanism from those opposite, Mr Speaker. We are dealing with those 9 years of delay and denial, and we will create reliable and cheaper energy for Australians.
Before I call the member for Wannon, he'll get the call. The member for Fairfax had a good go during that answer, and he'll leave the chamber under 94. The member for Fairfax will leave the chamber immediately. The member for Wannon has the call.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. On 30 May 2023, the government told the High Court it was an agreed fact that there was no real prospect of NZYQ being removed from Australia in the reasonably foreseeable future. Yet reports in The Guardian showed just last week the Minister for Home Affairs said she had operational advice about the case and that it was likely that the government would, quote, avoid it by deporting him. Did the minister sign off on the facts that the government put before the High Court on 30 May 2023?
Call to the Minister for Home Affairs and Cybersecurity.
Thank you, Speaker. Let me share a few facts that we have learned about this case with the House. The first is that we learned from the Minister for Immigration earlier in question time that NZYQ would not even have been here were it not for the incompetence of the Leader of the Opposition.
Order. Second,
Speaker, I will make no apologies for doing everything within my power to deport this person from our country. I'm not going to apologise that. In fact, Speaker, I would say again to the Parliament that if I had any legal power—
Order. The Minister is 30 seconds into her answer. The member for Wannon will only have one chance to raise a point of order on relevance. I'm not sure if he wants to do that right away. Okay.
I would.
Give him the call.
I was just calling for a statement of fact. Did the minister
Resume
sign
your
off
seat. Resume your seat. Order. Order. Resume your seat. The member for Wannon, I gave you a hint that it had to be on relevance, and you got up and you said what you wanted to say. So that's an abuse of standing orders, and you continually do that, and you'll leave the chamber under 94A. Order. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. And it's really disappointing to see the Shadow Minister leave the chamber because I've actually got a few questions for him. I would like to know what role he played in bringing his party into this chamber and voting against provisions.
The minister will pause. The minister will just return back to the question. She'll just return to the question. Yeah.
Excuse me, Speaker. Speaker, I would like to know what role the Shadow Minister played in bringing him and his colleagues. They've already had their point of order. Don't you know the standing orders, Fletch?
Minister, just going to ask you to pause. The Manager of Opposition. Order. The Manager of Opposition is seeking the call. I'll give him the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm asked the point of order on relevance, as you've ruled the previous point of order was not on relevance. The question was, did the minister sign off on the facts that the government put before the High Court? A very tight question. The minister should either answer it or be directed to sit down.
There was some detail apart from that, what the manager's just said. So there was a little more of the question. I think the manager knows because he's probably seen it. But I'm just... Yeah.
On the point of order, there was not a debate in the question otherwise. There was a preamble to set the question, which didn't raise other issues for contention. All they said, all that they went to in the Shadow Minister's question, made reference to the High Court, the agreed facts and a quote from the government. It showed where it had been contradicted by the Guardian's article and asked the minister to clarify. There wasn't a second question. There wasn't reflection on the minister otherwise. The question was,
resume your seat.
Was tight.
I know what the question is. I'm trying to deal with points of order and give the Leader of the House the call as well.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. As the Leader of the Opposition just stated, the opening of the question referred to the High Court case. The High Court case had somebody acting in it, and that's exactly the circumstance of that person that the minister is referring to.
Yeah, just to assist the House, I'm going to ask the minister to go back to the question and not talk about the opposition and talk about the question that she was asked about.
Thank you, Speaker. And again, I make no apologies for doing everything I could to get this person out of the country. I'd contrast that with the Leader of the Opposition because he's the reason that NZYQ was here to begin with.
Order. Give a call to the member for Paterson.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. What's the Albanese Labor government doing to ensure that our local and regional roads are safe and adequately funded after a decade of neglect?
Give a call to the Minister for Infrastructure. Order. Members on my left, the member for Groom. There's going to be silence before I even call the minister. The Minister for Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Local Government has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank very much the member for Paterson for her question. She knows how much investing in projects like Raymond Terrace Road are for regional communities. Can I also welcome the delegation of mayors from Queensland who I met with this morning, a really productive discussion. They do fantastic work for their local communities every single day. The Albanese Labor government is strengthening its commitment to road safety and by significant increases in funding to our local councils. local governments require more funding to manage the rising costs and increased pressure on transport infrastructure due to climate change, something those opposite doesn't seem to think is happening, and the extreme weather events we are all experiencing in our own communities. To support this, this government has doubled Roads to Recovery funding. This is for every single local council across the country. We are taking it from $500 million a year to $1 billion a year, something those opposite never ever did. We're not using colour-coded spreadsheets to determine which local councils are winners or not. We are making sure that every single local council across this country, in communities you represent, in communities the Independents and the Greens represent, and communities we represent, because we know how important local roads are. We know that local councils look after 75% of our local roads, and we know how important the doubling of this funding is. We are also increasing the Black Spot Road funding program, a funding again that those opposite wouldn't actually get the money out the door for. We want to make sure that every single dollar of that goes to local roads and goes to improving road safety. We are also creating a new program by merging the Heavy Vehicle Productivity Program, the Bridges Renewal Program, and increasing funding for that for local councils for some of those larger projects that we know are often beyond their means to do. And what have other people said about this decision? We've got the CEO of the grain growers. Now, those people they represent might drive a bit on some of those roads, and they've said to the governments, we welcome the strong support for local road funding and look forward to working with the government to improve our regional roads. The National Farmers Federation have said, we thank the government for the commitment to improving regional infrastructure through their new funding, and we too look forward to working with the government to improve our regional roads. The Australian Local Government Association. It is fantastic to see the government recognising the importance of local infrastructure and the key role it plays in building more resilient and connected communities. Only this government is committed to increasing money for local government and the roads that we all drive on every single day.
The minister's time has concluded. The member for Wright. When the House comes to order, I'll hear from the member for Fowler.
Thank you, Speaker. The question is to the Prime Minister. By 2030, 10 million passengers will travel through Western Sydney Airport. Western Sydney residents deserve metros and roads like other areas. We travel long distances for work. The East-West Metro has been cancelled, and now your government has cut $160 million from the M12-M7 connection, yet still funds the Epping Bridge expansion with $220 million. Why is Western Sydney treated as second class and not prioritised given our disadvantages?
Order. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank the member for Fowler for her question, and the premise of it, though, is completely wrong. Completely wrong.
Order.
As I have had discussions with Premier Chris Minns about, I am a major supporter of the second Sydney Airport. I think it is a very important piece of infrastructure, and it is something that does require a range of infrastructure around. Of course, Western Sydney Airport would be built had the Howard government, when they came to office, not cancelled funding for a project that was already under construction. That was already under construction and had the sod turn and had funding in the budget, funding that was ripped out by the first Howard budget back in 1996. That's what happened. It would have been up and operating for more than a decade now had that not occurred. Because the importance of Western Sydney Airport is that for the first time, instead of everything turning towards the centre of the CBD, it will be turned outside. Turned outside. We have.
The Prime Minister will pause. There's far too much noise between the Minister for Infrastructure and the member for Hume. The member for Macarthur will leave the chamber under 94A. There's far too much noise. I can't hear the Prime Minister's answer, and I'm sure the member Fowler wants to hear the answer as well. There's Prime Minister, in continuation.
Just going, Mr Speaker. The M7-M12 interchange is being built as part of a broader, fully funded agreement between New South Wales and Transurban. Between state government and Transurban were party to the agreement, to which the Commonwealth is not and was not under the former government a party. The Commonwealth government was not a party to that agreement over the M7-M12. That's just a fact. The interchange is an important project for the success of the new Western Sydney Airport, and it's scheduled to open in 2026. Now, I know those opposite like privatisation, but the idea that the Commonwealth, for something that's fully funded by a state government and a private entity that has the largest number of toll roads of any city in the world, Sydney, the largest number of toll roads of any city in the world, but it's a suggestion we should just give them more money, even though a project's fully funded. That's what's suggested by those opposite. Now, the Commonwealth is making significant investments in Western Sydney, including the $5.3 billion for the airport itself, $5.25 billion for the Sydney Metro, Western Sydney Airport and Elizabeth Drive overpass. The M12, $1.6 billion we have for the M12. That is the Commonwealth's commitment. M12, all under construction, all ready to go.
Ask him another question.
Order. Give the call. Order. Give the call to the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Social Services. How is the Albanese Labor government providing national leadership to bring about change and help end violence against women within a generation?
Give the call to the Minister for Social Services.
Thank you, Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for Moreton for that question. On Saturday, we did mark the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, beginning the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. The 16 days of activism provides us all an opportunity to elevate the impacts of gender-based violence and focus on what we can do collectively to end this scourge. One life lost to family and domestic and sexual violence is one too many. But I would like to acknowledge that it's been particularly a tragic few weeks in Australia, with a number of deaths of women allegedly killed at the hands of their intimate partner being too high. Australians are rightly shocked by these deaths. This violence has to end, and it is why our government is committed to action and investment to address this violence. Since coming to government last year, addressing family, domestic and sexual violence has been a top priority. During our first 18 months of government, we have delivered the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children and secured state and territory agreement in this plan. We've launched our first action plan and a dedicated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander plan. We've taken immediate and practical steps in all 4 domains of prevention, early intervention, response and healing and recovery, with our record investment of $2.3 billion in women's safety initiatives. We've reduced the time it takes victim survivors to access financial and casework through the Escaping Domestic Violence Payment. This is providing critical support when women leave a violent relationship. And this is complemented by a legislated 10 days of paid family and domestic violence leave for all employees. We've delivered funding certainty for states and territories to deliver frontline services. This funding was due to cease on the 30th of June this year. And we're building new safe places for women and children experiencing family domestic violence so they have a safe place to go. We are holding perpetrators to account for their behaviour through identifying risks posed by perpetrators and supporting earlier intervention. And for those perpetrators wanting to change their behaviour, we are delivering confidential telephone counselling and support. Of course, most importantly, we are listening to and learning from the experiences of people who who have experienced family, domestic and sexual violence. And that's why the appointment of our inaugural Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commissioner, Michaela Cronin, has been so important to ensure that the voices of victim survivors are elevated and central to policy making. By working together across this whole parliament, we can make a difference and end violence against women and children in one generation.
Call to the Prime Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I ask for the questions to be placed on the notice paper.